$20,000. That's what it costs to marry the woman you love in Thailand, they said. But John Russell wasn't just buying a bride. He was buying his way into the most elaborate financial trap he'd ever encountered. What started as a fairy tale romance on the beaches of Ko Samui became a nightmare that would drain his retirement fund and nearly destroy his will to live. This is the story of how tradition became weaponized into blackmail, and how a man who thought he'd found love again discovered he'd walked straight into the hands of professional manipulators. If stories like this fascinate you as much as they do me, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We dive deep into real-life stories that expose the dark side of international romance and financial fraud. John Russell was 54 when his world collapsed for the second time. The first collapse came 3 years earlier when cancer took his wife of 28 years, leaving him alone in their sprawling house in suburban Toronto, with nothing but memories and a comfortable pension from his career as a civil engineer. Sarah had been his everything, his college sweetheart, his business partner in life, his anchor. When she died, John felt like he was floating in an endless ocean with no land in sight. Friends and family urged him to travel, to see the world, to live a little. Sarah would want you to be happy, his sister Margaret kept telling him. For 2 years he resisted. He couldn't imagine being happy without Sarah. He couldn't imagine wanting anyone else. But loneliness is a persistent enemy, and eventually it wore him down. On a cold February morning in Toronto, staring at yet another day of empty rooms and silent dinners, John booked a flight to Thailand. He'd always wanted to see Southeast Asia, and Sarah had dreamed of visiting the temples of Bangkok. Maybe he could honor her memory by taking the trip they'd never managed to make together. Ko Samui wasn't even on his original itinerary. John had planned to stay in Bangkok for a week, maybe visit Chiang Mai. But a fellow traveler at his hotel mentioned the island paradise in the Gulf of Thailand, and something about the description. Pristine beaches, gentle people, a slower pace of life called to him. Within 24 hours, he was on a plane to Samui, carrying nothing but a small backpack and a heart still heavy with grief. The island embraced him like a warm hug. The turquoise waters, the swaying palm trees, the genuine smiles of the locals. It all felt like medicine for his wounded soul. For the first time since Sarah's death, John found himself sleeping through the night without nightmares. He rented a small bungalow near Chaweng Beach and extended his stay from 1 week to 2, then from 2 weeks to a month. He wasn't ready to go back to the emptiness of Toronto. That's where he met her, at an open-air concert near the beach, where local musicians played traditional Thai music under a canopy of stars. John had wandered over from his evening walk, drawn by the haunting melodies of the cane and the gentle laughter of the crowd. He found himself standing at the edge of the gathering, not quite part of it, but no longer alone. "Beautiful music, isn't it?" The voice came from beside him, accented but clear. John turned to see a woman in her early 30s, petite and graceful, with long black hair that caught the moonlight. She wore a simple sundress and had the kind of natural beauty that didn't need enhancement. But it was her eyes that caught him. Warm, intelligent, with just a hint of sadness that seemed to mirror his own. "Very beautiful," John replied. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just talking about the music. "Are you from here?" "Born and raised," she said with a smile. "I'm Rungnappa, but my friends call me Ning. And you're definitely not from around here." There was no judgment in her voice, just gentle curiosity. They talked through the entire concert, and when the last note faded into the tropical night, John realized he didn't want the conversation to end. Ning seemed to understand his reluctance to part ways. "There's a little cafe that stays open late," she suggested. "They make the best mango sticky rice on the island." That cafe became their place. Over steaming cups of Thai coffee and plates of sweet dessert, John found himself opening up to the stranger in ways he hadn't expected. He told her about Sarah, about the cancer, about the loneliness that had driven him halfway around the world. Ning listened without trying to fix anything, without offering empty platitudes. She shared her own story: a failed marriage to a Thai businessman, the struggle to support her aging parents, her job as a tour guide that barely paid the bills. "We're both refugees from broken dreams," she said at one point, and John felt something inside his chest loosen for the first time in months. Take a moment here and pause the video. Look at what I've told you so far about John and Ning's meeting. Write in the comments what seems suspicious to you at this point in the story. What details make you wonder if everything is as innocent as it appears? I'm curious to see if you're picking up on the same red flags that John missed in those early days. What happened next felt like a miracle to John. Ning began showing up everywhere. At his favorite breakfast spot, on the beach where he took his morning walks, at the little bar where he'd started having his evening beer. She always seemed surprised to see him, always had a perfect excuse for being there. "I was just showing some tourists the sunrise spot," or "my friend works at this restaurant." John never questioned these coincidences. He was too grateful for the company, too hungry for connection to analyze the probability of their frequent encounters. Within a week, they were inseparable. Ning took him to hidden beaches that tourists never found, to local markets where the real people of Ko Samui lived and worked, to temples where monks blessed their growing friendship. She introduced him to her culture with genuine pride, teaching him basic Thai phrases, explaining the significance of various traditions, sharing stories of island life that made him feel like an insider rather than just another foreign visitor. But it was the small intimacies that truly hooked John's heart. The way Ning remembered that he liked his coffee strong but not bitter, how she'd pick up a shell on the beach because it reminded her of something he'd said, the gentle way she'd correct his pronunciation of Thai words, her hand briefly touching his arm as she demonstrated the proper tone. These weren't grand romantic gestures. They were the building blocks of genuine affection. Or so John believed. The first red flag came disguised as vulnerability. They were sitting on the beach one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, when Ning grew quiet. John had learned to recognize her moods by then, and something was troubling her. "What's wrong?" he asked, taking her hand. The gesture still felt new enough to send a small thrill through him. "It's my parents," she said, not meeting his eyes. "They've been asking about you." John's heart skipped. In his grief-clouded mind, this felt like progress, like acceptance. "What have you told them?" "That you're kind, that you make me happy." She paused, and when she looked at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But they worry, John. They think you might leave, like the other Farangs who come here and break hearts." The word Farangs, foreigners, hit John harder than he'd expected. It was the first time Ning had really acknowledged the gap between their worlds, the fundamental difference in their situations. He was a wealthy Canadian on an extended vacation. She was a local woman whose livelihood depended on the tourism industry. Of course her parents would be worried. I'm not going anywhere, John said. And as the words left his mouth, he realized he meant them. Somewhere in the past month, Ko Samui had stopped feeling like a vacation and started feeling like home. Ning had stopped feeling like a holiday romance and started feeling like a lifeline. But the conversation planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the weeks to come. Ning began dropping hints about her family's financial struggles. Medical bills for her father's diabetes, repairs needed on their house, her younger brother's school fees. She never asked John for money directly, but she painted vivid pictures of hardship that tugged at his heartstrings and his wallet. In Thailand, when a man loves a woman, he shows respect to her family. She explained one evening as they walked along the beach. It's not about money exactly. It's about showing that you can provide, that you're serious about the relationship. John nodded, filing away this cultural information. He wanted to do right by Ning and her family. He wanted to prove that he wasn't just another tourist looking for a temporary thrill. When Ning mentioned that her mother needed medication that cost $300 a month, John didn't hesitate to offer help. When her brother's motorcycle broke down and he needed $800 for repairs to get to school, John transferred the money without question. Each time Ning protested, "I can't ask you for this," she'd say, tears streaming down her face. "It's too much." But John insisted. He had the money, and he had found something worth spending it on. The happiness of the woman who had brought light back into his world. Besides, these weren't gifts to Ning directly. They were investments in her family's well-being. Acts of service that proved his commitment and respect for Thai culture. The amounts grew larger. Ning's father needed surgery. $1,500. The family house required urgent repairs before the rainy season. $2,000. Each crisis seemed to arise just as John was starting to feel comfortable with their relationship. Just as he was beginning to believe that maybe, at 54, he could find love again. Looking back, John would realize that he'd been expertly managed from the very beginning. But in those sun-soaked weeks on Ko Samui, he saw only what he wanted to see. A beautiful, kind woman who needed him, who appreciated him, who made him feel vital and masculine and necessary again. The money felt like a small price to pay for the return of hope to his life. The trap was closing around him. But John Russell was too intoxicated by possibility to notice the walls pressing in. 3 months into his stay on Ko Samui, John's world had completely reorganized itself around Rangnapa. His small bungalow near the beach had become their shared space. Though Ning officially still lived with her family in a village 20 minutes inland, she'd moved in gradually, first leaving a toothbrush, then some clothes, then her laptop for her online tourism business. John loved the domesticity of it all, the way his space felt alive again with another person's presence. By this point, John had sent nearly $10,000 to help with various family crises. Each emergency had been presented with perfect timing and irrefutable logic. Ning's mother had been hospitalized with pneumonia, just as John was feeling guilty about spending so much on his extended vacation. Her brother's tuition was due exactly when John had received a particularly large pension payment. The roof repairs became urgent right after a violent thunderstorm that John had witnessed himself, lending credibility to the need. But it was more than financial dependence that bound John to Ning. She had become his translator, his cultural guide, his social coordinator. Without her, he realized he'd made virtually no other connections on the island. His Thai language skills remained elementary despite months of exposure. mainly because Ning was always there to smooth communications. His daily routine revolved entirely around her schedule. Morning walks when she was free, lunch dates between her tour groups, evening dinners that depended on her family obligations. "I've been thinking," Ning said one evening as they sat at their favorite restaurant overlooking the harbor. "About us, about the future." John's heart raced. They talked around this subject for weeks, dancing close to declarations of love and long-term commitment without quite crossing the line. He'd been afraid to push, afraid to assume too much about what their relationship meant to her. "What about it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "In Thailand, there's a process for these things. When a man wants to marry a woman, he must ask her parents formally. It's called the sinsod ceremony. It shows respect, shows that he values her and her family. Marriage. The word hung in the tropical air between them like a butterfly John was afraid to catch. "Are you saying," he began. "I'm saying that if a man wanted to propose such a thing, there would be a proper way to do it, a respectful way." Ning's eyes were fixed on her plate, but John could see the flush in her cheeks. That night, John lay awake listening to the gentle sound of waves on the shore, his mind spinning with possibilities. Marriage to Ning would solve so many problems. He wouldn't have to return to the emptiness of Toronto. He could stay in paradise with a woman who had brought joy back into his life. He could build something new from the ashes of his grief. The next morning, he brought up the subject again. "This sinsod ceremony," he said carefully. "How does it work?" Ning's explanation was thorough and seemed authentic. The groom would present gifts to the bride's family: gold jewelry for the woman, money for the parents, a formal request for their blessing. The amount varied depending on the bride's education, beauty, and family status. But it was crucial that the gift be substantial enough to show serious intent. "How substantial?" John asked. "For someone like me, someone educated from a good family." Ning hesitated. "Usually around $20,000. $20,000. John's pension could absorb it, especially if he sold some investments, and if it meant he could marry Ning, if it meant he could build a life with her. It seemed like a bargain. He'd spent more than that on the car Sarah had driven in her final years. "But there's something else," Ning continued, her voice growing softer. "The money. It's not really a payment. It's more like a loan to show you can provide. After the ceremony, the family usually returns most of it to help the new couple start their life together." This detail sealed John's decision. It wasn't really losing $20,000. It was temporarily demonstrating his financial stability. The money would come back to them as a couple, helping them establish their household. "I want to meet your parents," John said. "I want to do this properly." The meeting was arranged for the following Sunday at the family home. John spent the week in a state of nervous excitement, shopping for appropriate gifts, practicing his limited Thai phrases, trying to imagine his future life as a married man in Thailand. Ning coached him on proper etiquette: how to greet her parents, where to sit, how to present his request respectfully. But when Sunday arrived, Ning came to him with tears in her eyes and devastating news. "My father is in the hospital," she said. "Another diabetic episode. The meeting will have to wait." John's first instinct was sympathy and concern. His second was to offer financial help for the medical bills. But Ning surprised him by declining. "No, John, you've already done so much for my family. This time, we must handle it ourselves." Her nobility in refusing his help only made John love her more. Here was a woman with pride, with dignity, who didn't see him as just a source of money. When he insisted on at least visiting her father in the hospital, Ning agreed gratefully. The hospital visit was brief and carefully managed. John met Ning's father, a thin, tired-looking man who spoke no English but nodded appreciatively when Ning translated John's get-well wishes. Her mother was there too, a small woman who smiled shyly but seemed overwhelmed by meeting the foreign boyfriend. The younger brother Ning had mentioned was absent, studying for exams, Ning explained. Over the following weeks, as her father recovered, John found himself even more integrated into the family's crises and celebrations. He attended a cousin's wedding, contributed to a nephew's graduation party, helped fund repairs to the family's motorcycle taxi business. Each event deepened his sense of belonging, his feeling that he was becoming part of something larger than himself. The sin-sought conversation came up again a month later, but this time with more urgency. Ning's parents had been asking questions, she explained. Other families in their village were gossiping about their daughter living with a foreign man without proper commitment. The pressure was affecting Ning's reputation, and by extension, her family's standing in the community. I don't want to rush you, she said, but her distress was evident. It's just that in Thai culture, these things matter so much. John made his decision that night. He would propose formally, present the sinsod, and marry Rungnappa in a traditional Thai ceremony. He began the process of transferring $20,000 from his Canadian accounts, telling himself this was the beginning of his new life. He had no idea he was walking into the final phase of an elaborate con game that had been orchestrated from the moment he'd set foot on Ko Samui. The formal proposal was scheduled for a Saturday evening at Ning's family home. John had never felt more nervous or more hopeful. He'd had his hair cut at the best salon in Chaweng, bought a new shirt that Ning assured him was appropriate for the occasion, and practiced his speech in broken Thai until his pronunciation was at least comprehensible. The $20,000 sat in a Thai bank account he'd opened specifically for this purpose, ready to be presented as proof of his serious intentions. Ning had been unusually quiet in the days leading up to the meeting, which John attributed to nerves. My parents are very traditional, she kept saying. They want to be sure you understand the responsibility you're taking on. When Saturday arrived, John found himself being driven not to the modest house in the village where he'd visited Ning's father in recovery, but to a much larger compound on the outskirts of town. My uncle's house? Ning explained when John looked confused. For important family meetings, we gather here. The house was impressive. A modern two-story building with luxury cars in the driveway and expensive furnishings visible through the windows. John felt a moment of unease. This level of wealth didn't match the story of financial struggle that had characterized his relationship with Ning's family. Ning, he said as they approached the front door, I thought your family was having money problems. This doesn't look like... John, please, she interrupted, her voice sharp with stress. Don't embarrass me in front of my relatives. In Thailand, we don't discuss money the way you do in Canada. Inside, John was introduced to more family members than he'd known existed. There was Uncle Somchai, who owned the house and apparently several businesses on the island. Aunt Mali, who wore gold jewelry that could have funded a small business. Ning's cousin Cayman, who worked in Bangkok and drove a BMW. The modest, struggling family John had been supporting seemed to have vanished, replaced by prosperous relatives who looked at him with calculating eyes. Ning's parents were there too, but they seemed different in this setting, more formal, less warm than during his hospital visit. Her father, who had appeared frail and sick just weeks earlier, looked robust and healthy. Her mother wore an expensive-looking traditional dress and jewelry that definitely hadn't come from a struggling household budget. The ceremony began formally, with John presenting his request to marry Ning in his carefully practiced Thai. Uncle Somchai responded in rapid Thai that John couldn't follow, then switched to English. Mr. Russell, we appreciate your interest in our Rangnapa. She is precious to our family, educated, beautiful, from good bloodline, but marriage is serious commitment in Thai culture. I understand, John replied. I'm prepared to honor your traditions. Sinsod must be appropriate for women of Rangnapa's quality. $20,000 shows basic respect, but for formal ceremony, for proper recognition of her value, Uncle Somchai paused dramatically. $35,000 is more suitable amount. John's heart skipped. $35,000 was significantly more than they'd discussed. I was told 20,000 was the appropriate amount, he said carefully. 20,000 for village girl, maybe? Aunt Meili interjected. But Rangnapa is special. University educated, speaks 3 languages, comes from respected family. You want discount price for quality woman? The room fell silent. John looked at Ning, hoping for support. But she was staring at her hands, tears threatening to spill. I told you they might ask for more, she whispered. I tried to prepare you. But she hadn't prepared him. In all their conversations about the Sinsod, the figure had always been 20,000. Now, surrounded by Ning's extended family in this intimidating setting, John felt pressure mounting from all sides. Of course I want to show proper respect, he said slowly. But 35,000 is a significant increase from what we discussed. You think Rangnapa is not worth it? This from cousin Kamon, his voice carrying a hint of threat. You think Thai woman should be cheap for rich Canadian man? The conversation continued for another hour, with various family members taking turns explaining why the higher amount was not just appropriate but necessary. They had researched John's background, they said. They knew about his pension, his house in Toronto, his financial situation. $20,000 was insulting for a man of his means proposing to a woman of Ning's caliber. John found himself agreeing to the $35,000, though something in his gut was screaming warnings. The family's sudden wealth, their detailed knowledge of his finances, the pressure tactics. None of it felt like the respectful tradition Ning had described. But when he looked at Ning, saw her tears of what he interpreted as relief and happiness, his doubts faded. He loved her. He wanted to marry her. If this was what it took to honor her culture and secure their future together, he would find a way. That's when Uncle Somchai dropped the final bombshell. 35,000 is for Sinsod ceremony, but for wedding preparations, for proper celebration that shows respect to community, additional 15,000 will be needed. Total $50,000 paid before ceremony can be scheduled. $50,000. The number hit John like a physical blow. That was more than a year of his pension, a significant portion of his life savings. But as he looked around the room at the expectant faces, as he saw Ning crying into her hands, he realized he was trapped. Refusing now would mean losing Ning, losing face, possibly losing his safety in a room full of her male relatives who were looking increasingly unfriendly. I need some time to arrange that amount, John said finally. Of course, Uncle Somchai replied smoothly. We understand. These things take time, but until payment is received, no wedding plans can begin. Is family tradition. As they drove home that night, John felt like he was drowning. $50,000 was beyond what he could easily access. He would have to sell investments, possibly remortgage his house in Toronto. And something about the entire evening felt wrong. The surprise relatives, the double demands, the pressure tactics. Ning, he said as they reached his bungalow, this doesn't feel right. The amount keeps increasing. Your family seems much wealthier than you told me, and you think I'm lying to you? The fury in Ning's voice shocked him. You think my family's trying to cheat you? I didn't say that. I just think maybe there's been some miscommunication. There's no miscommunication, John. This is Thai culture. This is how we do things. If you don't want to respect our traditions, maybe you should go back to Canada. The fight that followed was their first real argument, and it was brutal. Ning accused John of being cheap, of not truly loving her, of treating her like a bargain-hunting tourist buying souvenirs. John tried to explain that it wasn't about the money, but about the changing parameters and the pressure tactics. But every word he said seemed to make things worse. By morning, Ning was gone. She left a note saying she needed time to think. Time to decide if she could marry a man who didn't respect her family or her culture. John was left alone with his doubts, his fears, and a growing suspicion that the woman he loved might not be who she seemed to be. That suspicion was about to become a devastating certainty. The next 3 days were torture for John. Ning wouldn't answer his calls or respond to his messages. Her absence from the bungalow felt like a preview of the emptiness that would consume his life if she left him. He found himself walking the beaches they'd explored together, eating alone at restaurants where they'd shared intimate conversations, wondering if his skepticism had cost him the only happiness he'd found since Sarah's death. On the 4th day, desperation drove him to action. He would go to her family's village, apologize for his doubts, and commit to the full $50,000. Love required sacrifice, and he was prepared to sacrifice whatever it took to win Ning back. But when he arrived at the address Ning had given him for her family home, he found nothing but an empty lot overgrown with weeds. A neighbor, speaking broken English, told him no family named Rangnappa had ever lived there. Confusion turned to panic as John drove around the village, showing Ning's photo to anyone who would look. Most people shook their heads or shrugged. A few recognized her face, but not as a local resident. She come here sometimes, one elderly woman told him, with different Farang men, always different men. The words hit John like a sledgehammer. Different foreign men, always different men. The implication was clear, but John's mind refused to process it. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Ning worked as a guide for multiple clients. Maybe the woman was mistaken. If stories like John's fascinate you as much as they do me, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I want to ask you something. Have you or someone you know ever been caught in a similar situation? Not necessarily in Thailand, but any time when love made you blind to obvious warning signs. Share your experiences in the comments below. Sometimes talking about these things helps us process the shame and learn from our mistakes. But John's desperate search for alternative explanations crumbled over the next several hours. At the hospital, where he'd met Ning's father, no record existed of any patient by that name. The uncle's impressive house was real enough. But when John worked up the courage to approach it, he was told by the security guard that it belonged to a Bangkok businessman who used it occasionally for vacation. No family named Rangnappa, no Uncle Somchai. The terrible truth was assembling itself piece by piece, and John could no longer deny what he was seeing. The woman he loved, The woman he'd been prepared to marry and support financially for the rest of his life was a fraud. Everything about her family, their struggles, their traditions, their approval of his proposal, it had all been an elaborate performance designed to separate him from his money. But the cruelest revelation was yet to come. That evening, emotionally shattered and financially violated, John sat in his bungalow trying to figure out his next move. Should he contact the police? Should he try to recover the money he'd already sent? Should he simply cut his losses and return to Canada with whatever dignity he had left? His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Russell, this is Kamon, Ning's cousin. We need to talk. Meet me at Sunset Bar in 30 minutes. Come alone." John's first instinct was to ignore the message. He'd had enough of Ning's family and their demands. But curiosity and a desperate hope that maybe this was all a misunderstanding drove him to the meeting. Cameron was waiting at a corner table, looking nothing like the threatening relative from the sin-sod meeting. Instead, he appeared nervous, almost apologetic. "Mr. Russell, I want you to know that I tried to stop this," he began without preamble. "What Ning and her crew did to you, it's not right." Her crew. John's voice was barely a whisper. "There are 5 of them. Ning is the primary operator. She's the one who identifies targets and builds the relationship. The others play family members, create the supporting story, provide authenticity. They've been running this operation for 3 years, targeting lonely foreign men who stay on the island for extended periods." The room seemed to tilt around John. "You're saying this was all planned? From the beginning?" "From the moment she approached you at that concert. They had been watching you for 2 weeks, learning your routines, your vulnerabilities. Ning specializes in recent widowers, men who are emotionally vulnerable but financially stable." Cameron's explanation was clinical and devastating. The chance encounters, the cultural education, the gradual integration into family crises. It had all been choreographed. The hospital visit, the uncle's house, even the formal sin-sod ceremony. Professional theater, performed by a practiced crew of con artists. "Why are you telling me this?" John asked. "Because I'm not really part of their operation. I'm Ning's actual cousin, and I've been trying to get her to stop this for months. What they do, it destroys people. Men like you come here looking for connection, for love, for a new start. They prey on that vulnerability. How many others have there been?" "In the past year, at least 6 that I know of. Some lost more money than you. One man, a German retiree, lost his entire pension fund before he realized what was happening." John felt sick, not just at his own victimization, but at the thought of other lonely, grieving men being systematically destroyed by this operation. "The money I've already sent, gone. Ning and her partners have it well hidden in accounts across Southeast Asia. Even if you could prove fraud, which would be difficult, recovering the funds would take years and cost more than you'd likely recover." As John sat there, absorbing the magnitude of his betrayal, Kamon delivered one final piece of information that would haunt him for months to come. "There's something else you should know. Ning, her real name is Siripon. She's not from Ko Samui. She's from Bangkok and she's married. Has been for 8 years. Her husband runs a separate scam operation targeting women tourists in Phuket. This is their business, Mr. Russell. Breaking hearts and stealing money is how they make their living." The woman John had fallen in love with, the woman he'd been prepared to marry and build a life with, didn't exist. Rangnapa was a character created specifically to manipulate his emotions and drain his bank account. The gentle, cultured woman who had seemed to understand his grief and offer him a path to healing was a professional predator who had studied his weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. John Russell had not just lost money, he had lost faith in his ability to judge character, trust in his own emotions, and confidence in the possibility of finding authentic connection again. The loneliness that had driven him to Thailand seemed like a minor discomfort compared to the isolation he felt now, surrounded by the wreckage of manufactured love. The confrontation with Ning happened 2 days later, and it was nothing like the dramatic showdown John had imagined. He found her at their old cafe, sitting with a new target, another middle-aged Western man who looked exactly like John had 3 months earlier. Hopeful, lonely, and completely unaware of the performance being crafted around him. When Ning saw John approaching, her face showed no surprise, no guilt, no emotion at all. She excused herself from her new mark and walked over to John's table with the same graceful movements that had first enchanted him. "I wondered when you would figure it out," she said in perfect English. Her accent noticeably reduced now that she wasn't performing the role of struggling local woman. "How could you do this?" John's voice cracked with the pain of betrayal. "I loved you. I thought you loved me." "Love?" Ning laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "John, you fell in love with an idea, not a person. You fell in love with your own fantasy of rescue and redemption. I just gave you what you wanted to believe." Her clinical detachment was more devastating than anger would have been. "What about everything we shared? The conversations, the intimacy, the plans we made? I'm very good at my job, and my job was making you feel special while separating you from your money. You made it easy. You were so desperate to believe that someone could love you again." The cruelty of her words was intentional, John realized. She was trying to hurt him, to make him feel foolish for ever believing in their connection. But underneath her performance, he caught a glimpse of something else. Perhaps the tiniest flicker of regret or discomfort. "Does any part of you feel anything about what you've done?" he asked. For just a moment, Ning's mask slipped. "John, you'll recover from this. You'll go back to Canada. You'll be sad for a while. But you'll be fine. You have money, security, options. Do you know what I have? I have this." She gestured around the cafe, at the tourist-filled beach, at the infrastructure of exploitation that surrounded them. "This is my economy. This is how women like me survive in a world that gives us very few choices." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to human emotion John had seen from her since Camon's revelation. "The man you're with now," John said, nodding toward her new target. "Are you going to destroy his life too?" "Probably." There was no satisfaction in her admission, just tired pragmatism, unless something better comes along. John stood to leave, then turned back. "The money doesn't matter, Ning, or Sirpon, or whoever you really are. What matters is that for 3 months you made me believe I could be happy again. Then you made me believe I was a fool forever hoping. That's the real theft. Not the money, but the hope." He walked away without looking back, leaving Ning to return to her new mark and begin the cycle of manufactured intimacy all over again. But John Russell's story doesn't end with his victimization. What happened next surprised everyone, including John himself. Instead of immediately fleeing Ko Samui in shame and defeat, John made a decision that would transform his trauma into something unexpectedly powerful. He was going to stay, and he was going to fight back. The decision came to him during a sleepless night in his bungalow, staring at the ceiling fan that had once seemed romantic, but now felt like a symbol of his foolishness. He could hear the waves outside, the same gentle sound that had lulled him to sleep during his happiest weeks with Ning. But instead of filling him with peace, the sound now reminded him of all the other lonely men who might be walking those beaches right now, vulnerable and hopeful and completely unaware of the predators watching them. John spent the next morning researching everything he could find about romance scams in Thailand. What he discovered was a massive, organized industry that preyed on thousands of tourists every year. Ning's operation was just one small part of a network that stretched across Southeast Asia, systematically targeting vulnerable foreigners with sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. But John also discovered something else. Very few victims ever reported these crimes. The shame of being deceived, the complexity of international law enforcement, the difficulty of proving emotional manipulation. All of these factors meant that operators like Ning faced virtually no consequences for their actions. That's when John decided to become a consequence. He started by documenting everything, every conversation he could remember with Ning, every family member he'd met, every location he'd been taken to, every financial transaction that had occurred. He created a detailed timeline of the scam, complete with photos, screenshots of messages, and bank transfer records. But documentation was just the beginning. John's engineering background had taught him to solve problems systematically, and he approached this fraud investigation with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to construction projects. He hired a local private investigator, a former Bangkok police detective named Chai, who specialized in tourist-related crimes. Together, they began mapping the entire operation. What they uncovered was more extensive than John had imagined. Ning's crew wasn't just running romance scams. They were part of a larger network that included fake tour companies, fraudulent investment schemes, and elaborate real estate cons. The operation had tentacles throughout the Thai tourism industry, with corrupt officials providing protection and legitimate businesses serving as unwitting fronts. But John's investigation revealed something else. He wasn't the only victim fighting back. Chai introduced him to Klaus Hoffmann, the German retiree Kamen had mentioned, who had lost his entire pension but refused to give up seeking justice. There was also Margaret Chen, a Canadian widow who had been scammed in Phuket by what appeared to be the same network. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance of vengeful victims. The breakthrough came when Chai's contacts in Bangkok police discovered that Ning's husband, Somchai, had made a critical mistake while running his separate scam operation in Phuket. He had defrauded an Australian businessman who happened to be connected to Thailand's Anti-Corruption Commission. The Australian had resources and political connections that most victims lacked, and his complaint had triggered a broader investigation into tourist fraud networks. John saw his opportunity. Through Klaus's connections with German diplomatic services and Margaret's relationship with the Canadian consulate, they were able to coordinate with the Thai investigation. Instead of being isolated victims seeking individual justice, they became witnesses in a major international law enforcement operation. The sting operation took 3 months to organize. John had to do something that terrified him more than losing money. He had to pretend to be vulnerable again. Under police supervision, he reached out to Ning through intermediaries, claiming he wanted to reconcile and was prepared to pay even more money for a proper wedding ceremony. Ning took the bait, perhaps because John's story of a heartbroken man desperate to win back his lost love was so believable. It wasn't entirely a performance. Part of him still missed the woman he thought she had been, even knowing it was all fabricated. The final meeting was set for the same uncle's house where John had first been pressured into the $50,000 payment. This time, he wore a wire and was surrounded by undercover officers. When Ning and her crew began their familiar routine of emotional manipulation and financial demands, everything was being recorded for evidence. But the arrest didn't unfold like a television drama. There was no dramatic revelation, no moment of triumph. When the police moved in, Ning simply looked tired. Her partners scattered or surrendered without resistance. The elaborate performance that had seemed so compelling and real crumbled into just another sordid crime scene. In custody, Ning revealed information that led to arrests across 3 countries and the recovery of money from dozens of victims. John got back about 60% of what he'd lost. But more importantly, he helped shut down an operation that had been destroying lives for years. The unexpected twist in John's story came 6 months later. During the trial proceedings, he had remained in Thailand to serve as a witness, renting a small apartment in Bangkok and learning to navigate the country as a person rather than a target. The Thailand he discovered was vastly different from the paradise of his original vacation or the nightmare of his victimization. It was simply a place where real people lived complex lives, just like anywhere else. That's where he met Dr. Apinya Suthisak, a legal advocate who worked with foreign crime victims. She was helping John navigate the Thai legal system, but their professional relationship gradually evolved into something deeper. Unlike his experience with Ning, this connection developed slowly and naturally, built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than manufactured vulnerability and exploitation. Apinya was everything Ning had pretended to be: genuinely intelligent, culturally rooted, compassionate about social justice issues, but more importantly, she was real. She had her own career, her own financial independence, her own goals that had nothing to do with John's bank account. When she disagreed with him, which happened regularly, she argued her point rather than manipulating his emotions. When she supported him, it was because she chose to, not because the script demanded it. The irony wasn't lost on John. He had come to Thailand seeking escape from loneliness and had nearly been destroyed by a counterfeit relationship. But in fighting back against that deception, he had found something authentic. A year after his first arrival in Thailand, John made a permanent move, not to Ko Samui, with its painful associations, but to Bangkok, where he started a consulting business, helping other expatriates navigate legal and cultural challenges. His experience as both victim and survivor gave him unique insights into the vulnerabilities that predators exploited. John and Apinya married 2 years later, in a small ceremony that honored Thai traditions without the theatrical manipulation of sin-sought payments. Her family welcomed him not as a financial resource, but as a partner who had proven his commitment through actions rather than money. The wedding cost less than $1,000 and felt more meaningful than the elaborate fraud he had nearly bought into. But perhaps the most unexpected part of John's transformation was his relationship with Ning herself. During the trial, he visited her in prison, not out of lingering romantic feelings, but from a complicated sense of connection to someone who had profoundly changed his life. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked during one of these visits. Regret what? Getting caught. Ning's defenses were lower in prison. Her performance unnecessary. Regret the choices that led you here. Regret hurting people who genuinely cared about you. She was quiet for a long time. I regret that I was good enough at pretending to care, that I sometimes forgot I was pretending. It wasn't the apology John had expected, but it was perhaps more honest than anything she had said during their entire relationship. Ning served 3 years in prison before being deported to her home province. John heard later that she had used her language skills to get work with an NGO, helping rural women develop legitimate business opportunities. He chose to believe that her punishment had led to genuine redemption. Though he recognized his need to believe in transformation might be another form of his old vulnerability to hope. 5 years after his first trip to Thailand, John Russell looked back on his journey with emotions too complex for simple categorization. He had lost money, dignity, and faith in his own judgment, but he had also gained a deeper understanding of human nature, including his own. He had learned that vulnerability could be either a weakness that predators exploited or a strength that allowed genuine connection. The loneliness that had driven him to Thailand in the first place had been real and valid. The desire for companionship, for meaning, for a second chance at happiness. These weren't character flaws to be ashamed of. They were human needs that deserved to be met with authenticity rather than exploitation. John's advice to other men and women facing similar vulnerabilities was both practical and philosophical. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, but don't let betrayal make you cynical about the possibility of real connection. The same openness that makes you vulnerable to predators also makes you capable of genuine love. The trick is learning to distinguish between people who want to share your life and people who want to steal from it. Today, John and Apinya run workshops for expatriates throughout Southeast Asia, teaching cultural awareness and scam prevention. They've helped dozens of people avoid the traps John fell into, and they've assisted law enforcement in prosecuting several other romance scam networks. But their most important work might be simply demonstrating that it's possible to recover from devastating betrayal and build something authentic from the ruins. John never forgot Sarah, his first wife, but he learned that honoring her memory didn't require closing himself off from future happiness. The beach bungalow in Ko Samui, where John first fell in love with an illusion, is now rented to other tourists seeking their own version of paradise. Some of them will find genuine experiences and connections. Others will encounter predators and manipulation. The difference often comes down to the same thing that determined John's ultimate fate. Not the absence of vulnerability, but the presence of wisdom about when and how to trust. If you've made it this far through John's story, I want to ask you to do something important. Share in the comments below what warning signs you noticed that John missed. What red flags would have saved him from this elaborate deception? Your observations might help someone else avoid a similar fate. But more than that, I want you to think about the people in your life who might be vulnerable right now. Recent divorces, widowers, people dealing with major life transitions. They need support systems that help them navigate emotional vulnerability without becoming victims. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be present for someone so they don't have to seek connection from strangers who might exploit their loneliness. John Russell's story is ultimately about the difference between authentic human connection and its counterfeit alternatives. In a world full of people trying to sell us fake versions of love, friendship, and belonging, the real thing becomes more precious and more worth protecting. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories that explore the complex reality of human relationships. And remember, your own story of recovery and wisdom might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. The waves still wash the shores of Ko Samui every day, indifferent to the human dramas that play out on its beaches. But somewhere in Bangkok, John Russell wakes up each morning next to someone who chose to love him, not because of what he could provide, but because of who he had become through surviving his worst experiences and choosing to grow from them. That might be the most unexpected ending of all. That the search for authentic love sometimes requires us to first survive its most convincing imposters.